My participation is very small, maybe a few slides, maybe 10 or 15 minutes max. I just want to cover a couple of issues, one being where we are with genomics, because it was a huge leap of faith on behalf of the AI industry 5 or 6 years ago. The other issue is EBI doing what we had hoped it would do, and are we still on the right track? I think it's only fair we ask ourselves that question, considering the AI industry to a large degree made a mess of things maybe up 15, 20 years ago and bet on the fertility of our cattle. And so it's only right that we go back and check that is doing what we had expected it to do. That's ourselves, we're 100% Irish farmer owned, which is, I think, a huge advantage in terms of we own the breeding programs and we own the bulls, etc., etc. The big change that happened from when I joined in 1996, which is 17, 18 years ago, we tested 12 dairy bulls in Ireland. Now, if you put that in the context of a Gaelic football team, and you're trying to find a team that's going to win the All-Ireland final, where you're looking to trial, as many footballers as you possibly can, and hence the big advantage the likes of Dublin has, etc., etc. But when you're only testing 12, the chances of you finding the Michael Murphys of this world, or the Henry Shefflins, etc., etc., is very, very slim. And guys of my generation would remember years where we had found one good bull and might find another good bull for 4 or 5 years. And now the thing has completely changed. This last year, 2014, we tested 4,500 bulls. And the expectation is for that to be in and around the same for this year, if not more. And as a result, you're obviously going to find far better bulls and far more of them. I think that's what's happened over the last few years. Why has it changed is because a testing program needs scale. And thankfully, a number of years ago, the Munster Cattle Breeding Company and ourselves, I think there was, when I joined, 12 AI stations in Ireland trying to buy bulls, etc., etc. It needed scale. There was serious rationalisation. The two groups got together and they formed what's known as the National Cattle Breeding Centre, or NCBC. That's just the background. That's one of the reasons why there's been a revolution in Irish cattle breeding over the last few years. And as a result, you would expect that we would have a lot of the top bulls. 10, 15 years ago, most of the top bulls were foreign. And we didn't know whether they were good or not on fertility, which is a key issue. Now most of the top bulls are Irish bulls, and thankfully we have 8 of them. I think here we are, yeah. The other big issue that has changed dramatically and has really kick-started the whole thing in Ireland was the development of a proper and functional, robust database. In other words, collecting all the information, particularly on farm, from farmers, from vets, from ourselves in the AI station, from milk recording records, from the different herd books, etc., etc., etc. And there's even all the information from your bull tank readings, your proteins, your fats, your cell counts, etc. And that's all fed into the one database. And the fancy name for the database is the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation. That's basically what the Irish Cattle Breeding Federation is. And it's only from this, once you have a critical mass of data, accurate data, it's from that then you can identify the bulls that are going to deliver profit on the farm. And I think by any standard, the database that we have in Ireland, owned by you, the farmer, is as good a cattle breeding database as there is in the world. The other big change that's happened, and just to speak a little bit about this, is the EBI and what exactly is the EBI. Well, the big change in the EBI is this here. Back in the old RBI days, pre-2000, it was all based on production. Fertility was introduced in 2000. Its emphasis was increased in 2004 and has stayed pretty steady up until the present day, and it's the same in 2015 as it was in 2013. The other traits were included as time went on, the likes of maintenance, health traits, calving traits and beef traits, and they make up the remainder of the index. But for me, the key point is the fertility and breeding fertility into our cows still commands 35% of the EBI index. And production overpaid for, lads. We can't ignore production. Production is 33% of the index, so it's pretty much on a par with fertility. And so a lot of farmers are asking now and considering now, do we need more production or bulls as quotas are gone, etc. And in my view, for the time being, there's plenty of emphasis on production in the index. But that's maybe a decision for yourselves when you're selecting your own bulls. So just to stay on the actual issue of production, and my experience is that Irish farmers, including myself and including my colleagues in Progressive, sometimes look at production maybe in the wrong way and maybe not in an accurate way as they might. And I think the key to remembering what is good production is the way we're paid for our milk. And if I asked, I do this on a daily basis to groups of farmers, if I asked what you paid for your milk, most people would say 30 cents a litre. And they're not wrong. But the reality is, and the majority of guys here are Glanbia suppliers, I'm assuming, but Glanbia in December paid $6.58 for a kilo of protein, $2.85 for fat, and they penalised you 4 cents for what's left over, which is water. And that is in effect A plus B minus C. And then they convert it back to give you what's known as the base price of 30 cents a litre. But this is the way you're now paid for milk. And the key thing there for me is, look at the extra value for protein over fat. It's, what is it, maybe it's over 2 times the value. And the likelihood is, if you're to talk to the people at the market face, within Glanbia or Kerry or whatever, they will tell you that the likelihood is the value of protein is going to rise, because that's where our extra milk is going to go, primarily to protein-based products. So when we start to select bulls and for the coming season and for the future, because breeding is all about the future, we need to keep that in mind. So the question is then when we look at bulls, what do we look for in a bull that gives us good production? And traditionally, and certainly this was the case in the vast majority of farms, they looked at kilograms of milk. But kilograms of milk without a high proportion of protein is only water. And it's only going to penalise you in your milk price. So looking at just kilos of milk on its own is definitely a wrong route to go. People are talking about just looking at the combined kilos of fat and protein. And you know, guys who are into this would say 30, 40 kilos of fat and protein. But what happens if 25 kilos of that is fat? And only 5 kilos of that is protein? Not necessarily a very good accurate way of doing it either. Protein percent can be very misleading. You can get a bull very, very high in protein percent with no milk, and therefore be a minus on kilos of protein. And that's why it's setting you backwards in terms of production per cow or production per hectare. So I would argue that actually none of these traits here are a good way of looking at production for the future. The real way of looking at, and like this here, if I asked is, and maybe some of you are brave enough to comment on it, what bull there is best for production? And you see that they vary from minus 286 kilograms of milk to plus 546 kilograms of milk. They vary from 40 kilos of combined fat and protein down as far as 25 odd kilos of combined fat and protein. From a minus protein percent to plus 0.35 protein percent. Huge variation in the different components that make up production. But the reality is, I think this is maybe the long-winded message that I'm trying to give you, is there's one index. There's one index on all bulls in everyone's catalogue, including ourselves, that does the A plus B minus C calculation for you. It takes into consideration the value of protein over fat, which is what it should do, and it chucks out what's known as this production index or production sub-index. And like all these bulls, basically, there's nothing between them when it comes to production. Once you apply the A plus B minus C calculation to it. So therefore, when I'm picking a bull on production, and I would suggest that you should do the same, I'm looking for a minimum of 100 on this figure here. I wouldn't be able to tell you what our bulls are on milk, fat and protein, but I would be able to tell you what they all are on production sub-index. Because in my view, it's by far the most accurate way of picking bulls when it comes to... look at, the reality is, lads, fertility is massively important, but fertility without production or vice versa is pointless. Okay, now the next issue I was going to flick back to very quickly before I hand you over to Gareth is in relation to genomics. And there's a bit of a debate out there at the moment as to whether or not genomics has worked and whether or not it continues to work. But in 2009, we launched genomics in Ireland, the first country in Europe to launch genomics. And just to give you a bit of background, genomics is, you take a hair sample from the calf, a day old or a week old, you send it off for a DNA analysis. And it gives you back, based on what's in the database and different SNPs, etc., on the DNA strand, on the chromosome, it gives you a prediction as to what that bull is going to do in terms of production and fertility, etc., etc. Very, modern, technical science. And the question is, has it worked? Is it doing what I said on the tin? We're in the nice position now, where we now have a full daughter proof on 190 bulls that they were only sold on Genomics. So we can compare like with like if you want. And if you look at the average for those bulls and how they what they were genomically, which is down this column here, and what they ended up as when they had their daughters milking. And you can see on a kilos of milk point of view, there was no real difference, insignificant. On fat and kilos of protein, no real difference. If anything, Genomics underestimated how the bulls performed on fertility. Not by a huge amount, but they did underestimate how the bulls performed on fertility. The one trait we can't go on as an accurate guide genomically is the calving difficulty figure. And anyone who's used to calving heifers knows how important that is. Like a 1.9% calving difficulty figure is fine for heifers. 2.7% calving difficulty figure is not fine for heifers. So Genomics did not predict that accurately, and as a result, you'll see in our catalogue, any of the bulls who haven't got a proper calving survey from farmers, we don't publish a calving difficulty figure, and therefore, in my view, should not be used on heifers. The other rule of thumb on that is, if you see a calving difficulty figure, the catalogue won't state that it's genomic or proper calving survey, but it needs at least an 80% reliability side. If it's not, you can't use on heifers. So look, based on that, you would have to say Genomics has worked pretty much done what I said on the tin. The other thing I'll just say very briefly is how these bulls, as an individual, apart from the overall average, look how they performed as individual bulls. And these bulls here these are top 10 selling bulls in 2012, sold genomically. Now they have their daughter proofs here, and you can see how they changed. So if you're unlucky enough to use this guy here at LLK at -40 and him only, well, you'd be pretty pissed off. And you know, if you're lucky enough to use him, well, then you'd be happy enough. But that's a bit of a lottery. And so the real lesson from this is, and I'm sure you can see it, the lesson is you have to use a panel of bulls. You have to use at least 4 or 5 bulls, and from that, they should average out and do, on average, pretty much what you're hoping to do. The other issue I'll say in relation to Genomics, and people are saying, I'm going to use an insurance policy against these bulls shifting around the place, and I'm going to use the traditional proof, the old daughter proof, where daughters are actually milking, and therefore nothing will change. Okay? Well, that's not true. And if you look at these panel of bulls here, were all daughter-proven bulls in 2012. And this is their proof now in 2015 as more information came into the system. And you can see they also changed. And that will continue to happen. And it's not a genomics issue. It's an issue to do with us looking to get a value on fertility. And fertility is difficult to measure. So if we're interested in chasing fertility, and we all are, like any Irish grassland farmer is interested in chasing fertility, well, then we're going to have to put up with this. It's not a massive variation, but it is a variation. And the way to get around it is just to use a panel of bulls. And this is just a couple of slides on whether or not EBI is doing what it should do. I could show you literally 40 slides on this from several different trials and several different analyses of data, etc., etc. The latest one is the trial down in Moore Park, the next generation herd. And very briefly, what they did down there a couple of years ago was they amalgamated or bought a group of elite cows, a herd of elite cows with an EBI of 244, which is, you know, in the top 1% or higher in the country. And they compared them and put them in beside and treat them basically the same as a group of cows that have in and around the national average. And they had a look and see how they performed. Well, first and foremost, the elite or the high EBI group of cows have given the equivalent of 105 euros more profit per lactation, which in a 100 cow herd is 10 grand, just on extra kilos of fat and protein. But the big one, for me anyway, is how they performed in terms of fertility. And huge submission rates. So these cows are easily managed, 92% submission rate. And Gareth will talk a little bit about this later on. 77% calve in the first 6 weeks. That means long lactations. Long lactations means really pushing your kilos of solids per hectare. And obviously, and again, those of us who hate empty cows, and we all do, 95% in calf in a very small, relatively short window, breeding window of 12 weeks. Now, in my travels, I've never come across anyone yet that's achieving that. And to me, that's the holy grail in terms of fertility. Like, that's, you know, profit on a plate for you. Now, the big thing, the big question now is, like, where can, that's a herd of cows brought together by people in Moore Park, elite cows across the country. How do we get there, and how long is it going to take us? This is my last slide. If you take the national average, and if you were out at the national average at the minute, when eBay in around 125, and you use a selection of the top 10 bulls we have available this year, which have an average EBI of 331, your calves in 2016 will be in around 228 of an EBI. The elite herd in Moore Park is 244. So in one cross, and also in one crop of calves, but in one cross we're almost there. And that's the big, like 2 years ago, even 12 months ago, we couldn't have said that. And that's the advantage of testing 4,500 bulls a year. It's a huge dividend to Irish dairy farmers in terms of being able to achieve that or have the genetic potential to achieve that 95% in calf rate. And the extra fat and protein, etc., etc. The last thing I say to you is, I said to you that my target, and if you can just remember these two numbers, the target in terms of a production subindex of 100 and try and target a fertility subindex of 150. And if you do that, you won't go too far wrong. Breeding isn't very